A woman was tied to a wooden post with her newborn twins. Her only crime was daring to love an Apache man. Yet in her final desperate breaths, a shadow appeared, changing forever the fate of 3 fragile lives. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The barbed wire bit through her skin, digging deep into her wrists, where the rope already cut raw. Every breath came sharp, clouding in the freezing air. The snow was heavy, falling steady, but the cold wind made it bite harder, like knives scraping bone. Nora's back was pressed to the weathered post at the far edge of the farmyard, her arms stretched and bound until her shoulders burned. She could feel her blood run sticky down to her palms. Beside her, 2 tiny cries cut through the storm. The babies, no bigger than a man's forearm, were wrapped in an old rag of a blanket so thin the wind tore right through it. Their faces were red from the cold, little mouths open in protest, fists too weak to do more than flutter against the air. Nora bent as far as the ropes allowed, trying to shield them. Her body was shaking, but she forced herself over them, blocking the gusts. "Don't be afraid, my darlings. Mama's here," she whispered, though her lips trembled so badly the words came out in broken pieces. From the farmhouse windows, a dim orange glow spilled into the night. She could hear the muffled laughter of her husband's kin voices rising as if in celebration. The sound carried across the field and landed on her like stones. Not one of them had turned back to look at her. Not one cared whether she or the little ones lasted through the night. Her tears stung as they froze against her cheeks. She pressed her face to the babies, the salt of her grief mixing with the damp from their breath. The wind tore at her hair strands, whipping across her eyes. She tried to push the pain from her mind, tried to think of anything but the fire eating her skin where the rope cut deep. And the memories came unbidden, unwanted, but strong, as if the cold had carved them loose. She shut her eyes and drifted into the past, where she could still see him, where her heart had still been whole. The trees had been green, then the creek running high after spring rains. She remembered the way the grass bent under their weight, as they sat close, their knees brushing both of them, whispering like the whole world might be listening. He'd told her stories in that soft voice of his words that seemed to carry the weight of generations, tales of eagles flying higher than storms of rivers that never stopped finding their way. And she had sat there listening like a soul starved, holding on to each word as if they were bread for the hungry. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel like a person, not a piece of property her father could trade. His hand had been calloused but gentle when he'd reached for hers, and she'd felt a steady warmth there that no fire in her family's house had ever given her. "You and me," he'd said one afternoon as the sun slipped behind the hills one day, "we won't have to hide." He had looked so certain when he said it, that she almost believed the world could change. She'd squeezed his hand, smiled a real smile, the kind that didn't come often in her father's house, and whispered, "I'll wait for that day." But days had a way of running out. It hadn't been long before her father found out. She still remembered the thunder of his boots on the floorboards, the slam of his hand on the dining table, the way his voice filled the whole house until the walls shook. "You'll not shame this family with savage blood," he'd spat, his face red and his eyes hard as stone. "You think you can ruin what I've built with some filthy Apache boy?" She had stood there trembling, trying to form words, but her throat had closed. Her mother sat silent, her lips pressed thin, her eyes cold and empty, as if she agreed but didn't dare speak. "Pa, please." She'd tried, but he cut her off with a glare that could stop breath. "You'll marry John Carter," he said. The Carters are landowners, church-going folk. They'll keep your name clean and give you the place you ought to have. I won't hear another word." Tears had filled her eyes, but he didn't waver. To him, her life was a piece in a game, and he meant to win. Her happiness, her love, none of it mattered. That night they locked her in her room. She pounded the door until her fists ached, whispered prayers to the empty air. She sat by the window, staring out into the dark, hoping, pleading that he would come. And he did. She heard the stone hit the glass, faint but sharp. Her heart leapt as she rushed to the window. There he was, standing in the moonlight, his eyes fixed on hers, the look in them both a question and a promise. She pressed her palm to the glass, her chest so full she thought it might burst. But then the shouts came. Heavy boots on the porch, voices raised in anger. Her father's men had seen him. She tried to wrench the window open, tried to scream his name, but the lock held. She heard the scuffle below, the thud of fists, the grunt of pain. She banged on the shutters, sobbing, "Please, please, stop!" But her voice was swallowed by the rage outside. Her father's voice cut through the night, sharp as an axe. "Teach him what it costs to trespass here." The blows grew louder, flesh against bone, and she knew. Her heart knew before her mind could accept it. She slid down against the wall, clutching her chest, as if she could hold it together with her hands. Then the silence. It was worse than the noise, the kind of silence that told her everything was broken beyond repair. Hours later, one of the servants came to her room. He wouldn't look her in the eye. His words were low, flat, as if they were just another chore. "He's gone. Best forget him, miss. Forget him." As if love that strong could be erased like chalk from a slate. As if the warmth of his hand, the promises whispered by the creek, the way he'd made her laugh for no reason at all, could vanish with a command. She had screamed then, raw, broken, a sound she hadn't known she could make. She threw herself against the locked door, pounded until her knuckles bled, begged. God begged anyone to wake her from the nightmare. But the world stayed silent. By morning, she was dressed in white. Her face in the mirror looked like it belonged to a stranger, pale and hollow, her eyes empty. Her mother fussed with the lace, her hands steady, her mouth quiet. Not a word of comfort, not a flicker of regret. When she walked down the aisle to the man her father had chosen, she felt as though she were already buried. Each step was heavy, each breath a chore. The church smelled of pine and candle wax, but she only smelled blood and earth. From that day, the light in her eyes went out. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when required, but inside, she was nothing but ashes. She lived in her husband's house like a ghost moving through rooms that were never hers, her soul chained to a grave no one else could see. Her father called it duty. Her mother called it honor. But to Nora, it was a prison. And the one man who could have freed her had been struck down by the very hands that had raised her. She had walked through the doors of her husband's house with her head down, white lace clinging to her like a shroud, the scent of flowers from the church still heavy in her hair. The house was big, tall-ceilinged, filled with the smell of wood polish and coal smoke, but to her it was nothing more than a cage. That first night the cage closed. She had tried to plead. She had tried to push him back, her hands shaking her words, stumbling from her lips. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw, "not like this." But John Carter was not a man who heard please. He held her down, his breath heavy with whiskey, his eyes cold and hard. Nora fought, clawing at his arms, twisting beneath him until her wrists burned, but she was no match for his weight. When it was done, she turned her face to the wall, her body trembling, her tears wetting the pillow. He rolled away without a word, leaving her curled like a broken thing in the bed. The next morning, when the sun pushed through the curtains, she could hardly move. She pulled the covers tight around herself, the shame so heavy she could barely breathe. Downstairs, she heard his mother bustling about, humming as if nothing had changed, as if Nora's screams from the night before hadn't carried through the halls. She thought of ending it then. She thought of tying the bedsheet into a knot and slipping away from the life they'd forced on her. She even stood on the chair once the fabric tight in her hands, but her feet shook and her chest heaved. The thought of the dark beyond terrified her, and when John found her there, he yanked the cloth away and struck her. Not across the face, never there. He was careful, always careful. His fists landed on her ribs, her back, her arms, places the world wouldn't see. And after the blows came the cold cloth, the bitter-smelling salve, his hands steady as he patched the bruises he'd given. "You'll learn," he said, his voice flat, like a man speaking to a horse too stubborn to break. "You'll do your duty." The days blurred into weeks. She tried again once with the sharp edge of a kitchen knife, pressing it against her skin until the sting brought tears. He caught her then, too, twisting the blade from her grip and slamming her to the floor. The blows that night left her unable to rise for 2 days. When she finally stood, her resolve was gone. She learned to be quiet. She learned to answer when spoken to move as he expected, to keep her eyes down when he drank. She carried the bruises like secret brands hidden beneath sleeves and long skirts. Her smile was something she wore like a mask, thin and empty, for the few who looked close enough to notice. Months later, she felt the first stirring in her belly. She knew before anyone else the faint flutter like wings beating against her palm. It frightened her, but it also gave her a reason to rise in the mornings. When the sickness came, when her body grew heavy, the Carters began to look at her differently. Their eyes softened, not with kindness, but with calculation. She could see it in the way his mother brought broth to her room, the way his father asked after her health. It wasn't Nora they cared for. It was the child, the heir, the bloodline they believed would secure their name and their land. At night, when John climbed into bed, she lay still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her thoughts on the tiny heartbeat inside her. She whispered to it in the dark words she could never say aloud in the daylight. "You're all I have," she breathed. "You're all that keeps me here." She would sit alone in the afternoons, her hands resting on her swelling belly, whispering, "You are my reason. You are everything." And for a time, she believed it. When the day of labor came, the pain was fierce, pulling her apart piece by piece. The room spun with heat, and the smell of sweat and her screams echoed off the walls. Hours passed like lifetimes, until at last, 2 cries broke through the air, twin girls. She reached for them with trembling arms, her heart bursting. But when the blanket fell back from their faces, the room grew still. The Carters leaned close, their smiles fading into horror. The skin of the little ones was not pale, but kissed by the sun, their eyes dark as the boy she had once loved. The truth lay there undeniable in the curve of their cheeks, the depth of their gaze. Nora clutched them close, her tears falling onto their tiny foreheads. "They're mine," she whispered fiercely. "They're mine." But the faces around her hardened. John's mouth curled in disgust. His mother gasped and turned away. His father's voice was low, sharp, like a blade sliding from its sheath. "She's shamed us. She's brought filth into this house." John's hand struck the wall, the sound like thunder. "She's ruined everything." That night there was no celebration, no songs, no prayers of thanks. Instead, the decision was made in cold, hard words. "We'll see to it," John said, his jaw tight. "She'll not disgrace this name any longer." And so they dragged her from the bed, still weak, still bleeding, the babies bundled against her chest. They carried her through the snow to the far edge of the yard, to the post wrapped in barbed wire that waited like a gallows. The wind howled, and she cried out, begging, pleading, "Please, they're only children. Please." But no one listened. No one turned back. They tied her fast, the wire cutting into her arms, the babies wailing in the night. Then they left her there, the snow swallowing their footsteps, their voices fading into the glow of the farmhouse. Nora bent low over the little ones, her body shaking, her blood dripping into the snow. She whispered to them, her breath turning white in the cold air. "You are my reason. You are all I have left, and I won't let go." And as the night closed in, her mind turned again to the boy in the woods, to the love she had lost, and to the cruel truth that had brought her to this place. The dirt track ended in nothing but dust and quiet. No sign marked the turn, just two leaning fence posts without a gate, and a trail so faint it all but disappeared among the withered brush. The wind had been pushing since dawn, and by late afternoon the sun hung pale, dulled by a haze of yellow grit. This wasn't the kind of place a man stumbled on by chance. You had to already be lost to come across it. Daniel rode slow the way he always did. His mare was foaming from the long trek south, but he let her set the pace. The saddle groaned under his weight, his rifle slung across his back, the canteen bumping against his hip. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, not even to the horse. There'd been no reason to until he heard the sound. It wasn't loud, not at first, more like the faint catch of breath carried on the wind, thin and broken. Daniel pulled his reins, turned his head, and listened hard. Then it came again, a soft, quivering cry, followed by silence. Then 2 tiny whimpers, weak and new, stitched into the edge of the winter air. He swung down from the saddle, tied the mare to a stunted tree, and moved forward through a patch of brittle sage and a line of broken fence rails. The air reeked of rust pine tar and old neglect. And there she was, a woman bound upright to a splintered post, her arms drawn behind her, her dress torn down the sleeve, dried blood streaking from her temple. Strands of dark hair, tangled and wild, hung across her face, half hiding her hollow stare. She didn't look at him, didn't move. Her eyes were wide open, blank as twilight. At her feet, wrapped in a worn-out horse blanket, lay 2 babies. Their cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, their little mouths working weakly as they fussed. Twin girls no more than a day or 2 old. One gnawed on the corner of the blanket. The other blinked slow, as if the world already weighed too heavy. Daniel crouched low. Her lips shifted just barely. The sound that came out was dry, cracked like gravel underfoot. "Don't. Take them." He slid his hunting knife free, worked careful cutting the ropes away. Her hands dropped like dead weight. She swayed once and collapsed forward, and he caught her in his arms. She felt lighter than a sack of grain, nothing but bone and silence. Looking down the slope, he spotted an old farmhouse half fallen in a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. No one in sight. But the ropes binding her were fresh. Whoever had done this hadn't been gone long. Daniel gathered up the twins first, tucking them into his saddle blanket and tying it snug across his chest. Then he lifted the woman, one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and carried her like something fragile toward the mare. "You're coming with me," he said. Not loud, not soft, just steady, the way a promise ought to be. She didn't answer. The ride back was slow. He walked beside the mare, steadying the babies against his chest to keep them from jostling. Once the woman's head lolled against him, and he pulled the blanket tighter around her. Snow began to fall again, lazy flakes big and wide catching on his eyelashes and sliding down his collar. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had sunk low, folding in on itself. The place wasn't much, just a single room with a wood stove in one corner and a cot by the window. Daniel kicked the door open with his boot and carried her inside. The warmth hit him like a soft breath, real and welcome. The twins cried louder now, their fists flailing hungry. He moved quick, but calm. He laid the woman on his cot and checked her over. More bruises than cuts. Her ankles were rubbed raw from rope. One eye was swelling shut. Her dress was torn near the chest, but Daniel turned his gaze aside. He pulled a quilt over her, then stoked the fire high. He set water to boil and dug out the last of the goat's milk he kept in a tin. Mixing it with rainwater, he warmed it in 2 small jars. The babies latched greedily, their little mouths working fast until their eyes fluttered closed. Only when they were asleep did Daniel sit back. He didn't sleep that night. He sat close to the fire, watching the slow rise and fall of the woman's chest. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but that didn't matter, not yet. What he remembered was the look on her face when he found her. Not fear, not shame, just surrender, like someone who had stopped expecting to be saved. At first light, she stirred. A low groan slipped past her lips. She turned her head toward the cradle he'd fashioned from his old shirt where the twins now lay. Her eyes opened, taking in the cabin slow as though she were waking into a different life. She found him crouched nearby, still in yesterday's clothes, hair damp from the snow. "You didn't leave us," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. Daniel shook his head. She tried to push herself up, winced, then fell back. He said nothing, only dipped a rag in warm water and held it out. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it to her cheek. Then she looked at him fully, her eyes searching. "You're not afraid of what folks'll say? Taking in a woman like me, with 2 daughters and no husband?" Daniel tilted his head, his voice steady. "You're safe. That's all that matters." She didn't cry, but something in her eyes shifted, faint and fragile like a spark where there had been only ashes. He didn't press her for more. Instead, he tended the fire, poked at the logs, and set a piece of bread down on a tin plate. Nora's eyes followed him as he moved about the cabin, steady and sure, like a man who'd lived alone a long time, but hadn't let loneliness turn him bitter. His quiet wasn't cold. It had a softness to it, the kind of quiet that felt more like falling snow than silence. Outside, a crow let out a single call before flying off into the gray sky. Inside, the twins shifted in their sleep. Nora pulled herself upright, wincing as she tugged the quilt around her shoulders. Her voice was faint, barely more than a breath. "My name's Nora." Daniel turned his head, gave a small nod. She kept her eyes on the fire instead of him. "Don't know how I'll ever thank you, mister." He looked away as he answered plain and steady. "Daniel. Nothing else. No last name. No town to tie him down. Just Daniel." The room fell back into quiet. Then the wind changed. pushing snow against the windows, with a sound like whispers trying to slip inside. Nora leaned forward, the quilt gathered in her lap, and said slowly, "You should know. They'll come looking. His folks. They won't take kindly to you keeping me." Daniel didn't turn from the fire. "I don't lose sleep over what men like that think." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She studied him, her gaze fixed on the set of his shoulders, steady as stone. Finally, in a voice so low it nearly disappeared, she said, "Then maybe I'm safe here." Daniel didn't move, but something in the way his shoulders eased told her he'd heard. Later that night, while she fed the babies by the glow of the fire, he stepped outside. The snow came down in thin, steady sheets, dampening his hair and collar. Above the pines stretched a wide, empty sky. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Not happiness, not hope, just purpose. He looked back toward the window, the golden light spilling from inside. She was still there. The girls were still breathing. And maybe this trail he'd been on so long wasn't ending after all. Maybe it had just turned. The fire never died. Not once in the 6 days since Daniel had carried her through the door. He was up before sunrise, adding wood in the quiet blue of dawn. He kept it alive through the day, stirred it again at dusk, and fed it between chores without needing to be asked. Nora noticed, even though he never spoke of it. Just as she noticed how he always stepped outside whenever she undressed the babies, giving her privacy, like it was something sacred. The silence between them wasn't uneasy. It was chosen careful, as though both knew too many words might break the fragile peace they'd found. By the end of the first week, Nora's steps were steadier. She could walk without swaying. The dark bruises on her neck had faded from purple to a dull yellow. The angry burns on her wrists had begun to heal, bending now without pain. She wore one of Daniel's old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled at the cuffs, and a skirt she'd patched together from 2 worn pillowcases. It didn't sit quite right, but she didn't complain. When she spoke, her voice was always measured, like she was afraid too much sound might shatter something delicate. The twins, whom she'd begun calling her little snowbirds, slept longer stretches, their cheeks rounder and pinker each day. Without saying a word to her, Daniel had carved 2 rattles out of pine scraps, small flowers etched along the handles. He left them on the windowsill one morning, never mentioning them. When Nora found them, her hand hovered over the carvings, her lips parting as though she might cry. But she didn't. She tucked the rattles into the cradle and quietly went back to folding cloth. That was how they spoke, through gestures more than words. Every morning Daniel rode out before noon, always back by dark. He'd return with a bundle of feed-chopped wood or scraps of cloth from town. Nora never asked what he did, though. In her heart she guessed. Maybe ranch work, maybe trading, maybe something else he didn't care to share. Deep down, she wondered if he was keeping their presence a secret, shielding them from the world outside. The town hadn't come calling yet, but she could feel the silence pressing in heavy like storm clouds gathering. One morning, while he was fixing something by the door, she asked softly, "Need me to help with anything?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her with that steady, unreadable gaze of his, the one he gave when he wasn't sure what to do with the weight of a question. Then, without a word, he handed her a bucket and motioned toward the well. For the first time in days, she smiled. The weight of the bucket grounded her, gave her hands something real to hold. Her body was still frail, but each step grew steadier with purpose. Outside, the air smelled of thawing snow and pine needles waking after the freeze. Ravens moved low between the trees, their wings silent but heavy in the crisp morning. She filled the bucket water, spilling over and soaking the hem of her patched skirt. She didn't mind. For once, it felt like her feet belonged on solid ground. She carried the bucket carefully, her arms trembling but her steps sure. The air smelled of pine sap, warming in the late sun of thawing snow sliding off the branches. When she rounded the corner toward the cabin, she saw a mule tied up near the fence post. Its blanket was stitched bright red with initials she knew weren't Daniel's. Her chest tightened before she even saw the woman. Evelyn Parrish stood by the porch rail, her bonnet pulled low, her sharp eyes already scanning the yard like she was inspecting land she didn't own. Evelyn turned when Nora stepped closer, her thin lips curling in something between a smile and a smirk. "Well now," she said, her voice carrying a false warmth. "You look healthier than I expected. Daniel's been keeping you fed, has he?" "Well," Evelyn said, eyeing the twins' cloths drying on the porch line, "you look far too alive for someone buried by her husband's kin." Nora tightened her grip on the bucket. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Is Daniel inside?" Nora nodded. Evelyn stepped closer. Her voice dropped like a stone in a still pond. "People are talking Mississippi, about him keeping you here, with 2 babies, with no name." Nora stared at her. "My name is Nora." Evelyn sniffed. "A name don't carry much if you got no ring on your finger, dear." She turned toward the house with a smirk that curled sharp. Evelyn tilted her head, studying her the way a crow studies a piece of bread left out in the snow. "And those are the little ones I heard about," she went on, stepping toward the doorway where the babies lay swaddled inside a wooden cradle. Her tone still had that light neighborly lilt, but her eyes sharpened. Nora followed her glance, her stomach knotting. The twins had stirred their dark eyes, blinking up at the light from the doorway. Evelyn leaned closer, her face going pale. She pulled back as if she'd touched a hot stove. "They don't look like him," she said, her voice lower now, the warmth gone. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders, though the chill was not outside but in Evelyn's words. "They're mine," she said quietly. Evelyn's lips pinched tight. "They've got the look of Indians," she hissed, her voice trembling in a way that told more of fear than anger. "I've seen faces like that before. You ought to know what people will say. You think folks around here will welcome you? A woman dragging in 2 Apache brats? Lord have mercy, Daniel." She stopped herself, pressing a hand to her chest, as if the thought alone was dangerous. Nora's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Evelyn shook her head slowly, as if pitying the ruin she saw, then straightened her bonnet and forced a thin smile. "You'll find out soon enough," she muttered, and with a tug on her mule's reins, she left her skirts brushing the snow like whispers of judgment. Nora stood on the porch long after Evelyn's figure disappeared between the trees. Her chest ached, her breath shallow. When Daniel stepped out moments later, he didn't ask what was said. He only took the bucket inside and set it down. She followed her eyes, lowered her body, trembling though the fire inside the cabin was strong. That night she sat by the hearth, her babies pressed against her, as if to shield them from the world. Daniel worked quietly at the table, mending a hinge. She finally whispered, "She saw them. She knows." Daniel didn't look up. "Let her know." Nora's throat tightened. "She's afraid. Afraid of them." His hand stilled on the hinge. Then, calm as stone, he said, "That's her burden, not yours." For the first time, she realized he meant it. He wasn't swayed by whispers or fear, and though her heart still raced, something in her eased at his words. A week later, the sound of hooves broke the quiet morning. Nora was at the window folding small cloths when she saw them 3 riders moving through the fog, their shapes hard against the white. Her hands froze, the cloth slipping from her lap. She knew the man in the front. Even at a distance, she knew. Matthew. Her chest collapsed inward. She snatched the twins into her arms, holding them close, her breath caught like a trapped bird. By the time the knock hit the cabin door, Daniel was already standing from the table. He opened the door to find Matthew Carter on the step, flanked by 2 rough men with rifles slung across their shoulders. Matthew's face was older, lined with bitterness, but his eyes burned the same way they had when he'd forced her hand years ago. "Well," Matthew said, his voice hard as a frozen creek. "She's here." His eyes slid past Daniel into the cabin, landing on Nora. She felt them like a hand gripping her throat. Matthew stepped forward, but Daniel didn't move aside. "She doesn't belong to you," Daniel said evenly. Matthew's jaw worked. "She's my wife, and what I do with my wife and her brats is no man's say but mine." Nora tightened her hold on the babies. "No," she whispered, though her voice shook. Matthew's glare snapped to her. "You shut your mouth, girl. You think you can hide out here dragging my name through the mud with those things?" He jabbed a finger toward the cradle, his face twisted with disgust. "They ain't mine, and I'll see 'em gone before they shame me further." Daniel's hand closed on the door frame, steady but strong. "You won't touch them." Matthew's face reddened. He shoved forward, but Daniel stood his ground. "You think you can keep what's mine?" Matthew barked. "I'll take her back and I'll see those squaws tossed in the river where they belong." Nora gasped, her arms tightening around the twins, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. That was when Daniel moved. No rifle, no blade, just his hands, quick and sure. Matthew swung first, a clumsy, rage-filled blow. Daniel caught his arm, twisted, and sent him stumbling into the snow. The 2 men beside him stepped forward, but Daniel's eyes fixed on them, cold as iron. "Try it," he said, low, steady. The men hesitated, glancing at each other, then at Matthew, cursing in the snow. Matthew scrambled up his chest, heaving his pride, bleeding faster than his lip. He spat into the dirt. "She ain't worth it. Not her, not them. You'll regret this, rancher." Daniel didn't flinch. "Go." Matthew's face twisted once more, but he yanked his reins and turned his horse. The others followed. Their silhouettes vanished into the mist, swallowed by the trees. Nora sank to the floor, clutching her daughters, her breath shuddering. Daniel closed the door, his steps heavy but sure. He didn't look at her right away. He set the latch firm, checked the rifle by the wall, then finally turned. "I didn't ask you to fight for me," she whispered. "I didn't do it for you," he said quietly, crouching beside her. His voice was steady, not soft, not hard, just steady. "I did it because no one ought to have to beg for peace in their own home." Her eyes met his, wet and wide. She wanted to speak to thank him, but the words caught. Instead, she pressed her face to the babies, whispering promises only they could hear. Daniel laid a hand on the edge of the cradle. Outside, the snow began again, quiet and steady, covering the tracks of the men who had come to claim what was never theirs. That night, Nora sat by the fire long after the babies had drifted off. She didn't pick up a needle, didn't rock in the old chair, just sat still, her eyes fixed on the flames while Daniel worked on the cabin door hinge. After a long while, she finally spoke. They'll never stop reminding me I don't belong here. Daniel kept his hands moving, not lifting his eyes. You belong here, he said simply. She shook her head, her voice trembling. Not here. Not in this town. Not in any town. Daniel set the hinge down quiet on the table. I don't live by what towns think, he answered, calm and plain. Nora's hands tightened in her lap, knuckles white. You don't know what it's like, she whispered. To be treated like you're dirty just because you gave birth to girls. To be seen as nothing but another mouth something folks think isn't worth feeding. A burden in a woman's skin. Daniel finally looked over at her, his face steady. His voice came slow, measured. I know what it's like to be alone so long you stop hearing your own name, he said. Her eyes lifted, meeting his. I know what it's like to have folks point at your silence and call it wrong. To be stared at like a question nobody wants to answer. The fire popped between them. He gave a small nod toward the cradle. I ain't raised babies before, but I know enough to see they ain't curses. Nora's eyes stung. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table toward her. It was a jar of sweet cream, likely bought in town. Heard you missed this, he said softly. Her lips pressed tight. She didn't cry, only gave a small nod, and took the jar with both hands, holding it like it was something sacred. The next morning, she found him out by the fence line, driving posts into the thawing ground. She carried him water without a word and stayed to pass him nails. The cold wind bit their cheeks, but side by side they worked. Daniel didn't say a thing, yet she felt it that something between them had shifted. Like the rope that kept her soul tethered to this world had been tied down a second time. One afternoon, she came across a small book on the mantel. It was an old, worn volume of Psalms. On the inside cover was a faded note written in a woman's hand. To Daniel, from your mother, for when silence gets heavy. Nora turned a few pages. Some verses were underlined faint notes scribbled along the margins. The paper smelled of pine and dust. Daniel came in behind her, his steps quiet. I didn't know you read scripture, she said softly. Only the ones that feel like songs, he replied. She smiled faintly. That night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and the twins wouldn't settle. One wailed until her tiny voice cracked. Daniel, without being asked, lifted her gently into his arms and paced the floor, whispering words so low Nora couldn't catch them. The crying eased little by little until both girls slept again. When he turned back toward Nora, his eyes met hers. For a moment, it felt like he was truly seeing her, not just the bruises fading from her skin, but the pieces of her she thought were long gone. He didn't speak, just gave a small nod before returning to his chair by the fire. She stayed across from him, the firelight playing across her face. The silence stretched, but it was different now. No longer the silence of fear, but of something new, something that was slowly taking root. Unspoken, gentle, hopeful. Nora felt her breath come easier. Her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the cradle. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was barely surviving in someone else's shadow. She felt she was building something real, though not yet named. Daniel watched her from across the room, calm and patient, as though he knew not to rush whatever was growing between them. Outside, snow swirled lightly against the windows, but inside the fire burned steady, keeping the cold at bay. The season began to turn quiet and slow. Winter loosened its hold bit by bit, not in great leaps, but in small, careful signs, the distant call of a bird returning the steady drip of melting ice from the eaves, the faint, clean smell of pine needles waking from under the thaw. The cabin, once buried in white, now showed patches of dark earth freckles on its shoulders. Inside, the twins grew stronger. They babbled often, their small mouths shaping sounds that weren't yet words, but were full of intent. Nora's days filled with rocking them, feeding, folding laundry, humming soft tunes. Her hands no longer shook her steps, sure. She tied her hair back differently now, loose with a faded ribbon Daniel had once brought from town. Her cheeks had gained color again, and when she smiled, the expression lingered. Daniel had taken up carving. At first, it was little animals for the girls, bears, rabbits, a lopsided horse. Then one morning, Nora noticed him out on the porch working slow and steady on something bigger. It was a cradle larger than the makeshift one in the cabin. The wood was smoothed at every corner, the sides etched with small notches, as if counting each day she'd stayed. He didn't bring it up. He just set it by the fire one evening and left it there. Nora ran her hand across the wood, tracing the marks, feeling the care behind each stroke. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask. Some things were too deep for words. Daniel sat on the floor by the fireplace, running his whetstone slow and steady along the edge of his knife. Nora's voice broke the quiet, low and tired. "I don't belong anywhere. You belong here," he said without looking up. Her eyes dropped to her lap. "I've never belonged anywhere," she said again, even softer. "You belong here," he repeated, his tone as steady as the fire's crackle. She lowered her head further, her words almost a breath. "I've never belonged anywhere. Not with my husband. Not in his family's house. I was just something to marry. Something to bear children. Nothing more." Daniel set the blade aside, rose and walked to the stove. He poured warm water into a tin cup and placed it gently in her hands. "You're not a thing," he said. "You're someone." Her fingers shook as she lifted the cup, sipping slow. Her eyes closed, her shoulders sagged. "I'm so tired of running," she whispered. "Then stop." His words were plain, certain, like a truth that had been there all along, waiting to be spoken. I don't know how she admitted, her voice cracking. He lowered himself beside her, one knee pressing into the worn floorboards, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the cradle. "You stay," he said simply. "That's how." Her breath caught her chest tightening. Slowly, she turned her face toward him. In her eyes was something that wasn't tears, but older, deeper, a kind of longing she couldn't name. Daniel didn't reach for her. He just stayed steady and grounded like a rock in a river. She laid her hand against his. Their fingers didn't weave together, they just touched. Yet the weight of that small contact stole the air from her lungs. For the first time since her wedding night, since her husband's death, since the ropes had burned her wrists raw, she felt truly seen. Seen without a word, without judgment, fully and quietly. She looked down at his hand, calloused and still beneath hers. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I know, and I may never be. I'll still be here." She lifted her eyes to his, searching. Why Daniel stood, walked back toward the fire, his back to her. His voice was low when it came. "Because you stayed when you could have left." Nora had no answer. She sat in the glow of the fire, holding his words close. The days after Daniel never mentioned the men who had come to the cabin. Instead, he moved quiet but sure, adding locks to the back window, shoring up the porch posts, cleaning the rifle more often. But he also built a small playpen for the girls and brought Nora spools of yellow thread from town. She understood. He wasn't just guarding the house, he was protecting the life that had begun to grow inside it. One evening, she stood at the window with the twins playing on a blanket beside her, watching Daniel mend the gate out front. The world had gone still, the sky a deep purple bruised with the last of the sun. He looked up once and caught her watching. She didn't turn away. Their eyes held through the glass, through the cold air between them, through all the words they hadn't spoken. Something passed. Then, not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. The wind outside had changed. No longer the angry howl that had rattled the cabin's eaves all winter. It moved soft and low, like the land itself was finally resting. The thaw crept in quiet, loosening the ice from the pine branches, coaxing little shoots of green from the dead grass. The world was shifting, and so was she. Barefoot on the porch one morning, a baby on each hip, Nora stood facing the sunrise. Her eyes lifted as if drawn to it, steady as a compass finding north. She realized she didn't know when the cabin had stopped being a place she hid in and started becoming a place where her roots took hold. Maybe it was the cradle Daniel had carved, smoothed by careful hands. Maybe it was the way the morning light warmed the wooden floorboards under her feet. Maybe it was the way he'd called the girls our little thistles, tough little things that weather storms. Or maybe it was that he'd never once asked her for anything in return. Not a debt, not a promise of the future, just the choice to stay if she wanted it. That morning the knock came. Not on the cabin door, but deep inside her chest. A letter had arrived. The letter came in the hands of a red-faced clerk riding a mule that looked near worn out. It was from a cousin on her mother's side, one of the few blood ties that hadn't vanished like smoke in the wind. The words inside offered her a way out, a house of her own, a nursemaid to help with the girls, and the promise of inheritance from a grandfather's estate most folks had long forgotten. It spoke of comfort, a room she could call hers, a fresh start for the girls with a new name, a chance to begin again without Daniel. Nora held the paper between her fingers like it might burn her skin. When she showed it to Daniel, he didn't press her with questions. He read it once, folded it neat, and handed it back with only a nod. His eyes didn't waver, but they were quieter than usual. He didn't tell her to stay, didn't even say her name. He only stepped outside and started saddling the horse. By noon, her bag was packed. She sat on the porch with it resting by her side, the cradle-close sunlight striping the trees in front of her. The girls slept nearby, one with her thumb tucked in her mouth, the other with her tiny fist curled like she was ready to fight the whole world. Daniel came up from the barn carrying a small bundle. He set it down beside her cheese bread, a skin of water, and a spare wool blanket. He didn't take a seat, just gave her a nod. "You'll be all right," he said. Her eyes blinked slow. "And you?" He glanced toward the far ridge. "I was all right before." The words made her flinch, not from cruelty, but from the gentleness with which he spoke them. "You're not going to stop me?" she asked softly. He shook his head once. "Ain't ever been my place." Nora looked down at her daughters. "They like it here. They'll like wherever you are." She stood, though her legs felt heavy each step, like her bones knew what her heart hadn't caught up to yet. At the edge of the porch, she turned back. "Do you want me to go?" This time his eyes met hers. Something cracked in his face. Not weakness, just plain truth. "I want you to stay," he said, "but only if that's what you want." Her throat tightened. "And if I do, I'll build you a life," he answered, his voice low. A quiet one. one where you don't have to fight just to get through the day. Her knees nearly gave way. Daniel looked down at the girls and added, "They deserve a man who'll guard 'em like sunrise and supper. And I've got hands that ain't done much good till you gave 'em something worth working for." A broken laugh slipped out with her tears. Then for the first time he stepped toward her, not with stillness, but with a warmth burning in his chest. Not the kind that scorches, one that steadies. "I don't have a ring," he said, "but I've got a home that knows your name and a fire waiting for your hands to tend it. That's what I can give." The bag slid from her hand, hitting the porch with a dull thud. Her face crumpled not from grief, but from surrender, to hope, to safety, to him. And when Daniel opened his arms, she didn't draw back. She stepped into them, a woman finally believing she had a place. He held her the way no one ever had, not tight, not crushing, but wholly present, as if he was making room for every piece of her, the broken, the strong, and the parts still learning how to breathe. The girls stirred in the cradle, blinking wide-eyed at the world, as if waiting for someone to leave. But this time, no one did. The wedding took place 3 days later. Evelyn Parrish showed up half out of protest and half because she couldn't stand not knowing. She brought a jar of pickled beets and wore a look that seemed to say, "I told you so," though she never had. The preacher was old and hard of hearing, made Nora repeat her vows twice. She spoke louder each time, her voice trembling but sure, finally knowing what it meant to promise. Daniel kept his words plain, looking at her like she was the only thing left that made sense. "I choose you," he murmured. "Every day, even the hard ones." They kissed, and the girls squealed as if cheering. The pines outside bent in the breeze like they'd bowed for the moment. That night they sat together on the porch under a sky bright with stars. Daniel leaned back against the railing, boots off legs, stretched out, hands behind his head. Nora sat cross-legged beside him, one baby asleep in her lap, the other curled against her feet. Neither spoke for a long while. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm. Finally, Daniel said, "You never told me what you wanted. Not once." She looked over, a small smile tugging her lips. "That's because no one ever asked. Till now." And now he asked. Her smile lingered. "I want days that aren't full of noise. I want bread that rises in the oven and daughters who don't grow up learning to shrink. I want a man who doesn't make me earn safety." He nodded. "Then that's what we'll build." She rested her head on his shoulder. The fire inside the cabin burned low but steady. Far off, a coyote called into the night and got no reply. Here in their small corner of a wide and lonely world, the silence no longer carried sorrow. Only peace. Only warmth. Only the sound of two daughters breathing easy beside two people who had finally found what they'd never dared to ask for before. A home that stayed. And that, my friends, is the story of Nora. A woman who went from being thrown away, beaten down, and stripped of her worth to finding not only safety, but also a place where she and her daughters could finally belong. This story is painful, no doubt. It shows us the darkest sides of cruelty, prejudice, and how society can turn its back on the most vulnerable. But more than that, it shines a light on resilience. Nora's journey reminds us that even in the coldest winters of life, there can be a spark, someone willing to stand beside us, not because they want something in return, but because they see our humanity. Daniel didn't rescue Nora to be a hero. He gave her space, respect, and the simple dignity of being seen as a person again. And isn't that what we all long for? To be valued, not for what we can give, but for who we are. The story also speaks volumes about motherhood, how a mother's love can keep her alive when the world has given up on her. And it challenges us to think, how do we treat those who are different, or those society has judged unworthy? I think the biggest lesson here is that home isn't a building. It's the people who choose to stand by us, even when the world says we don't belong. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What part of Nora's story touched you the most? And what lessons do you take away from it? Share your thoughts down in the comments. I always enjoy reading your perspectives. Until next time, take care of each other. And remember, even in the harshest winters, kindness can be the fire that keeps someone alive.